Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. You may want to have a drink for this one. That's all I'm going to say.
Hello and welcome to Q&A. I'm Fran Kelly. And tonight we're in Melbourne collaborating with the Wheeler Centre's Broadside Festival. On our panel, anti-ageism author Ashton Applewhite, Egyptian-American feminist Mona Eltahawy, businesswoman and social change agent Hannah Asafiri, Indigenous screenwriter and activist Nayuka Gorry, and Jess Hill, whose latest work is challenging old assumptions about male violence. Please welcome our panel.
Yeah, I wasn't joking about having a drink to watch this one. A really, really big drink. You're going to need it. Because there is a lot of insanity in this one, trust me. Now, this show does go for an hour long, and I'm not going to go through every single minute of it, which is what I normally do, but if I did it with this one, this would be 20 episodes long, and I'd never end up finishing it. So what I've done is I've gone through and I've taken out some of the best parts which I want to reply to. I'll try to fit them all in one video. Maybe I'll split it into two, but I'm not doing any more than that. Now, you may notice up in the corner I've added a little clock, so you know from what part of that hour that I got the clip from. So if you want to go and look at the original and make sure that I haven't, taken anything out of context, or that I haven't quote mined or anything like that, please feel free to do that. You'll find a link down below in the description, as always, as well as at the end of this video, along with any other citations that I might use. The other thing to note is that I won't be responding to these clips in chronological order, so I'm going to start with the second last question, which was asked towards the end of the show, because there's some interesting stuff there, and then I'm going to jump back to the start. So I'll probably jump around a bit if you notice the time jumping around a bit, but there is some seriously crazy shit here. And if you don't know what this show is, it's a show called Q&A here in Australia. It's on the ABC, which is the government-funded network. So this is my tax money going into this shit. Basically, it's a panel of feminists talking about how evil the white capitalist patriarchy is, and how everything bad is the fault of those evil men. So without any further delay, let's jump into this and get it over and done with.
Question comes from Beth Kay.
Thanks, Fran. Recently, there's been a lot of discussion of toxic masculinity and its impacts on society. But my question for the panel is, aren't the constraints of femininity and masculinity toxic in themselves? And what does positive masculinity look like?
Mona?
I find it really fascinating that we've heard about so many instances of male violence against women.
Yeah, and that's basically all we talk about. We never talk about female violence against males, or female violence against children, or, female violence in general, right? Although female violence is brought up a couple of times in this show, and it's excused away. It's even referred to as acceptable violence, whereas male violence is unacceptable, as we'll see a little bit later. Anyway, let's continue, because it's about to get crazy, folks.
That real incidents, whether it's disabled women or women in domestic abuse of all forms of abilities. And yet when I talk about imaginary violence against men, everyone's like, oh my God, Mona wants us to kill men. And I'm just asking you to imagine a scenario that is the daily reality for women everywhere.
Yeah, she doesn't seem to realise that the vast majority of violence in society is actually towards men, and in fact men are far more likely to commit violence against other men, and women are 10 times more likely to commit suicide than to be killed by a male partner. She seems to be totally unaware of any of this. Apparently the only type of violence which exists is male violence against women, and that's it. Now, if you think I'm exaggerating, just keep watching.
I agree with you that yes, the gender binary is long overdue. Let's get rid of it. Fuck the gender binary, yes. But we are also talking about a society that socializes boys and men into believing that they are entitled to women's time, bodies, love, affection. In the United States, that has a direct impact into boys as young as 16 going into school and shooting to death half their class because a girl said no.
So what would positive masculinity look like?
I have no fucking idea.
Hannah.
So she basically can't conceive of any positives to masculinity. It is just all negative. And that's because she thinks that masculinity is the cause of all the world's issues. That's pretty much what she says throughout the entire show. But I do have a simple question. Which gender is more likely to step in and help a stranger in need? You know, maybe someone's being assaulted in public, maybe a woman is being beaten up by someone, or maybe someone is in danger somehow, maybe someone's trapped in a burning building. Which gender is more likely to risk their own life to save a stranger, in particular if that stranger is female? I'll let you decide which gender that is and whether that is actually a positive thing or not. I think it's a positive thing from the standpoint of society, maybe not so much for those individuals who are risking their lives and getting no thanks for it from bigoted harpies like the ones on this panel.
Positive masculinity is an empowered woman who raises and teaches and will nurture attitudes of respect towards women.
I did warn you. I did say that you would need a drink to watch this. Now, don't fucking say I didn't warn you. Don't you dare say, Bane, why didn't you warn us that we needed a drink to watch this? Because I fucking warned you. This is some crazy shit. But positive masculinity is a strong woman teaching people to respect women. Okay? I don't even know how to respond to that. I give up. That's it. I don't know what I'm supposed to say to that. It is such a ludicrous fucking thing to say. Let's just continue.
I
sign on to that.
Nayuka? I can't believe I'm going to do this. Positive masculinity does exist amongst men.
So at this point, you're probably thinking, wow, you know, a sane person is actually on this panel as opposed to all the others. Yeah, wait until you see some of the shit she says later on. You may change your opinion. But at least she's willing to admit that there are positive aspects to masculinity. Kind of. It's a start, I guess.
It does exist. Like, I see it, I see it sometimes amongst my uncles, or I see it, my brother, for example. I think there are examples out there, when we... Yeah, I don't want to live in a world where it's like, well, all men are crap, so whatever, and it's...
Oh, so what you're saying is you're an anti-feminist, because I don't want to live in that world either, and that's why I'm an anti-feminist. That's not what you're saying, though, is it?
I think it's kind of reductionist to... There's something... Sorry, full disclosure, I'm pregnant with twins and my brain is absolutely fried.
No, but the point is you're pregnant with twins and I don't know what they are, but they might be boys, therefore you've got to be thinking about positive masculinity.
I seriously have been thinking about this.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Initially I was scared. I was like, what if I raise a cis straight man?
So let me put in context what she just said then. It's no different than someone saying, what if I have a child that turns out to be gay? It's no different. It's exactly the same thing.
Like, what am I going to do? But that's just, I think that's crap. This thing that, this masculinity and femininity, like for me, they're things to be played with, that we can have fun with them, that can be traps for a lot of people.
It's a trap!
I think particularly white kind of patriarchy and white patriarchal values traps people, and I kind of feel sorry for dudes. Like, scented candles are really beautiful. I brought my brother one the other day, and I'm like, man, you've missed out for like nearly 30 years because men aren't meant to do it.
Now, I think she brings up a very valid point here. I mean, clearly men are oppressed by the white cis-het capitalist patriarchy, which is part of white supremacy, because it's preventing us from owning scented candles. And clearly that's a crime. Clearly that is the most heinous thing which is affecting men today. It's not the high male suicide rate, or being prevented from seeing your kids after a divorce, or not being believed if you're a victim of domestic abuse, or disproportionate sentencing for exactly the same crimes, or, not having your bodily integrity respected and protected by the law. None of those things really compare to men not being able to buy scented candles. It's and I think it's something we don't talk about enough, probably because, we are living in a white capitalist patriarchy, which is part of white supremacy, and it doesn't want us to talk about the scented candle issue. Now, hopefully one day, feminists can smash the white capitalist patriarchy, and after that happens, everyone can own scented candles. There'll be scented candles everywhere for everyone, of all races and all colours and all sexualities and all genders, except for white males, because we'll all be dead. I won't live to see that paradise because I'll be burning in hell next to Satan because I'm a filthy white male. But, for the minorities, they'll finally be free from the oppression of the white capitalist patriarchy, and I think that's good because scented candles for everyone, right?
But I think the softness and the beauty and the positivity is there. Anyway, I'm rambling.
Jess? I'm stopping you rambling now. Jess, help me.
You don't need rescuing ever. I think that positive masculinity looks like positive humanity. I think that, imagine us talking about what does positive femininity look like. I don't know. As I grew up, I didn't think about being a woman. I just thought about being a person. Unfortunately, sometimes as I grew older, I was reminded how very much I was a woman, especially when I was sexually harassed. And, that was like an imposition on what I basically felt was our fundamental humanity. What does positive masculinity look like? It looks like getting back in touch with who you are as people and not trying to define yourself by being one or the other.
Okay, as far as this panel goes, I guess that's not too bad. I mean, she's basically saying, just be yourself, right? And don't get too concerned about gender stereotypes and fitting into those stereotypes, etc., etc. Just be who you are. That's not bad advice, right? But predictably, she's just about to fuck that up.
And especially not trying to define yourself by not being a girl, because that's what toxic masculinity teaches us. It's like, you are a man primarily by rejecting, feminine features like compassion and understanding and talking and having best friends, And
scented candles.
Really? Those are feminine features. Compassion, understanding, talking and having best friends. Men don't do any of those things. They're not male features. And men reject those things because they don't want to be feminine. Really. I guess I've been doing masculinity wrong all these years. As have all the other males that I know. It's strange. But, I'm sure a woman telling us how to be masculine, I'm sure there's no problem with that. Anyway, let's continue.
And scented candles.
All right.
Oh, yes, and of course the scented candles for everyone, except, the white males, because they're icky. Anyway, could you imagine a man going on TV and saying that women reject positive male features like logic and reason And the reason why these women reject these positive male features is because they hate men and they don't want to be like men. Could you imagine someone making that argument? Do you think a lot of people might laugh at that person? I think we would. But apparently these women can go on national television and say the gender-flipped version of that, and no one has a problem with it. Strange. So what about men rejecting femininity? Why exactly do some men do that? Now, feminists like these ones will tell you it's because these men have been taught to do this because of the toxic patriarchy which controls their lives. I don't believe that. First of all, I think gender is a very, very complex mix of nature and nurture. I think it's partly genetic and partly social. But feminists tend not to believe in the genetic part. They tend to think that gender is a social construct, especially the more radical feminists. They believe that men reject femininity because they've been taught that femininity is wrong and inferior and blah blah blah. You've heard all the arguments before, I'm sure. But let's for a second assume that gender is entirely a social construct. Once again, that's not what I believe, but let's just go with this for a second. If that is the case, would it be men teaching other men this, or might it be the fault of women? The feminists watching this will be going crazy at this point, saying, Bain, clearly you're a misogynist. What are you talking about? Women have no influence on society. They're like jellyfish pushed through the ocean by the tides, unable to swim in any direction. Well, luckily I'm not a feminist and don't believe that. Let me ask you a very simple question. If a group of women were going to a strip club to see some male strippers, which do you think they would prefer to see? Do you think they would prefer to see a man who looks like this, or some men who act like this?
Now we come to Dick Tracy. You know, I love the title, but the movie just left me limp. I know what you're saying. This is what I don't get. All the characters fit their names. You know, Flat Top had a flat top, Prune Face looked just like a little prune, but I never got the chance to see.
Now, admittedly, these are two extremes to illustrate the point, and most men don't fall in either extreme. But the point is, most women are more likely to go for the muscular, masculine guy than the effeminate men. And because of that, if a man is interested in attracting women, he is more likely to act masculine. Now, having said all that, I think people should act and be the way they're born, and if someone is more effeminate, then that's perfectly fine. But the simple truth is they're less likely to attract women, and they're more likely to adopt a masculine attitude in an attempt to be more attractive to women. Feminists don't seem to realise this. They don't seem to realise that a lot of the way men act is in response to what women want and desire. If women suddenly found bald men attractive, men would be shaving their heads left, right and centre in an attempt to outdo each other. It's really that simple. Anyway, next.
Our next question is a video from Belinda Day from Echuca in Victoria.
Our mum, Tanya Day, died in custody because Victoria Police targeted her for being drunk in public. They then failed to properly care for her after they locked her up in a police cell. In all Australian legal history, no police officer has ever been held criminally responsible for an Aboriginal person's death in custody, despite hundreds of Aboriginal people dying in their care. As Aboriginal people, we know that racism was the cause of our mum's death and is the cause of so much pain and harm in this country. How do we get institutions to acknowledge racism, and how should people be held to account?
So I'm guessing most of you don't know about this case, so I think the best thing to do is to look at some facts as we know them before moving on. So let's have a look at an article about it from The Guardian.
The Yorta woman, 55, was catching the V-Line service from Macloud to Melbourne on December 5, 2017 to see her family. Day had been drinking. Just past Bendigo, about 2 hours into her journey, she started to nod off. By Castlemaine she was asleep, her legs allegedly blocking the aisle.
Okay, so for those of you who aren't from my neck of the woods, let me just give you a little geographical lesson about Victoria. Okay, so we have Melbourne down here, which is where I'm from and where Tanya Day was headed. Echuca is right up the top here, up in the country. It's a long way away, so it was a very long train trip. The V-Line service she was on is the country train, which operates outside the metropolitan area. And where the cops arrested her was Castlemaine, which is just below Bendigo.
As the train pulled into Castlemaine, the conductor told her to move. He had called the police to request help with an unruly drunk passenger who could not find her ticket. The police arrived at 3:10 p.m. and shook Day awake. They decided to arrest her and take her to the police station under an archaic but well-used offense, being found drunk in a public place.
Now, as someone who used to go out drinking a lot when I was younger, I can tell you from personal experience that the cops don't arrest someone for being drunk in public unless they have good reason. I have seen people arrested by cops before for being drunk in public, but every single one of them was being a fucking dickhead. Every one of them was making a scene and disturbing the peace. If cops just wanted to arrest people for being drunk in public, they would wait outside any pub or nightclub and just arrest anyone who walked out the front door. There has to be the added thing of being a disturbance, and it seems, based on the Guardian's account, that she was a disturbance. She was being unruly, she couldn't find a ticket, they couldn't wake her up properly, and I'm guessing she was probably abusive as well. Although that, admittedly, is speculation on my behalf.
Shortly after 8 p.m., when police would have been preparing to release Day from custody after a 4-hour spell to sober up, they realized something was wrong. An ambulance was called, but did not arrive for almost an hour.
Okay, so there's quite a few questions we should be asking at this point. The first one is, why did an ambulance take an hour to get there? Well, the thing is, I don't know what the normal response time is for an ambulance in Castlemaine at that particular time. You have to keep in mind that Castlemaine is a country town with less than 7,000 people in it. It's not like it's a big city. Now, we know from the next part of the Guardian's article that they took her to Bendigo Hospital, which is a 28-minute drive away. So there's a good chance that the ambulance had to come from Bendigo to Castlemaine, which accounts for roughly about half the time that they had to wait for the ambulance. So why did it take an extra 32 minutes at least? It's possible that it was just busy. That happens sometimes when there's a limited number of resources, particularly in country towns. But I think we can rule out racism for that particular thing. I don't think the police rang up and said, we have an Aboriginal woman here, so, take your time getting here. I'm pretty sure the ambulance would have got there as soon as it could. Now, the other thing I want to discuss is the police locking her up in a drunk cell for 4 hours and letting her sober up without checking on her. Well, assuming they didn't check on her, and I'll get to that in a second. But I don't know what the normal practice is for the police in Castlemaine. Like I said, it's a small town with a small population. I don't know how many police are there, and I don't know how busy they are. It might just be normal practice for them to lock someone up in a drunk tank for 4 hours and then go and let them out without checking on them at any point. I don't know if they're required to check on them every hour or whatever. And they may have gone and checked on her and it looked like she was sleeping. I don't know. Because the article does say they realised something was wrong, not that they found her in a pool of blood or whatever, right? So it would seem that it's when they went to wake her up to let her out that they discovered that something was wrong. They might have actually walked by and did a visual check on her at some point and it seemed like she was just sleeping it off. I don't know. But if the police were required to check on her, say, every hour, if that's the procedure, and they failed to do so, and they didn't have an excuse, like, you know, they were just flat out busy with other things, then yeah, there's an issue there. But like I said, I don't know what the standard procedure is for a country police station, so it's hard to say. The other question I should ask is, would they have done exactly the same thing with a drunk white male? And I'm guessing they would have.
By the time Day arrived at Bendigo Hospital, she had been bleeding in her brain for almost 5 hours as a result of a traumatic injury sustained when she fell, unnoticed, in the cell. A large black bruise covered her forehead. She did not wake between then and 22 December, when she died in Melbourne's St. Vincent's Hospital.
Okay, so another important question to ask is, when did the injury happen? So she fell in the cell and hit her head and injured herself, but when did it happen? If it happened, say, in the first half hour that she was placed in the cell, and the police failed to notice, then that's a much stronger case for the family, right? Because the police have a duty of care, and maybe they should have been checking to see if she's okay. Like I said earlier, I don't know what the procedure is, but there might be an argument there that they were negligent. However, if the injury happened, say, in the last half hour that she was in the cell, which is also quite possible, then it's conceivable that the police were checking on her the whole time, and it's only in that last bit that she injured herself. These are important details that we need to know before we decide what exactly happened. So just to finish off the Guardian's article, here's a small paragraph from one of her daughters.
You see plenty of times on the line that people are on the train intoxicated, or they are asleep, or are actually making a scene, and they are unruly, and they are being aggressive, but the police do not get called, Watson says. And here's Mum, an Aboriginal woman asleep on the train, and she's deemed unruly? That speaks volumes to us.
So her daughter would have us believe that she was just asleep on the train, just an innocent, elderly Aboriginal woman minding her own business, having a sleep on the train, like a lot of white people do on long trips. And the racist conductor and the racist police targeted her because, they don't like the colour of her skin. I don't believe that. I tend to think that the term unruly is a big clue as to what exactly happened. The fact that she didn't have a ticket or couldn't find her ticket, the fact that she was blocking the aisle with her feet, all these things would suggest to me that, unruly might be a mild description of what actually happened. Now, I don't catch V-Line trains very often, but I have seen drunk people on Metropolitan trains being arrested by the police. In fact, one particular story which I was involved with, it happened, I think maybe about 20 years ago. I'd been in the city with my girlfriend and we were on our way back to my place on the train. A guy got on the train, clearly drunk. He was abusive to numerous people, just singling people out, abusing them, swearing loud, you get the idea. And an elderly man who must have been in his 80s asked him to be quiet. And this guy stood up and spat at the old man and threatened him with violence. It's at that point that I got up from my seat and ran at this guy. I got about 2 inches from his face and screamed at him, "Shut the fuck up and sit down." And you better believe that's what he did. He did not say a fucking word for the rest of that trip. Not that it was very long for him. I should point out that I'm rather a big guy, and he probably shat himself. So at the next station, someone obviously told the station staff, who called the police, and the police came about 10 minutes later. So the train was somewhat delayed, as you can imagine. And the police came on the train, they went up to him, had a couple of words to him, and then dragged him off. And I'm not exaggerating when I say everyone on that carriage cheered. Literally cheered. And need I point out, he was not Aboriginal. He was simply a drunk asshole. Now, if he had got on the train drunk, sat down in his seat and bothered no one, then the police would not have been called. And the police would not have dragged him off. But he had to be a drunk asshole. He had to be abusive and swearing and disrupt everyone else's trip. And because of that, the police dragged him off. That fucking simple. So before I go back to the video, just let me ask 2 questions. The first one is, can some police be racist? And the second question is, do the police target some people based on appearance? Now the answer to both those questions is yes, and once again I know this from personal experience. Once again, it was about 20 years ago, I had a run-in with a drunk off-duty police officer who was a racist piece of shit. It's rather a funny story, at least for me, not so much for him. It's rather a long story. Maybe I'll tell you the story at the end of this video, but if I tell you now, it will just distract from actually getting back to the purpose of this video. But yes, some police can be racist pieces of shit, just like anyone else from any other job, including panels of feminists on TV shows on the ABC. Each and every one of those panelists on that show are racist pieces of shit. You just have to listen to the way they talk about white men and whites in general. But need I point out that because some police can be racist pieces of shit, it does not mean that all police or the majority of police are racist pieces of shit. Nor does it necessarily mean that racism was the main cause or a cause of this particular woman's death. So what about the second point of police targeting people based on their appearance? Yes, this is a fact. I know this. I've had police actually admit it to me. You see, I myself have been targeted by police. When I was in my 20s, for a while there, it felt like every time I left my home, I was being asked where I'm going, what am I doing, have you got ID, etc, etc. You see, I'm a metalhead, and in my 20s, it was fairly common to have someone come up to me and say, "Hey man, has anyone ever told you that you look like Max from Sepultura?" And I would say, "What, you mean in the last 5 minutes?" And they'd go, "What?" And I'd go, "No dude, you're definitely the first one to ever tell me that." And they'd go, "What?" Needless to say, I've aged a lot better than Max did. But that's another story. But being a metalhead, having long hair, dressed in a leather jacket and a goatee, I was like a fucking magnet to cops in my 20s. Now I should point out that I've never been arrested, never been to court, never been in trouble with the cops in any way. But boy was I stopped a lot and asked, "What are you doing? Where are you going? Have you got any ID?" etc, etc. And the last time I remember this happening to me, it must have been in the early noughties. I think it was around the time the third Matrix movie was coming out, to be honest. So it was a while ago. They started leaving me alone as I got a bit older, for some reason. And I was waiting at a station for a friend. He was catching a train over to my place. I think we were going to the movies or something like that. And unbeknownst to me, he missed his train, so when the train pulled up, he didn't get off. 2 undercover cops did though. Now I was sitting outside the ticket area, so I didn't need a ticket. And I was completely sober, just minding my own business, not talking to anyone, not interacting with anyone, not disturbing anyone in any way. And of course they went straight up to me, asking for ID, "What are you doing? Why are you sitting here?" etc, etc. And I started a bit of a conversation with them because, one of the reasons I've never been arrested by cops is I'm not an asshole to them. I'm not stupid. I've always asked, "Why are you asking me and not other people?" But I'm not an asshole about it. I don't abuse them, I don't yell at them, because that's not a smart thing to do. That's the type of shit that gets you dragged off by the cops. So I said to one of the cops, "Why is it that people that look like me tend to be targeted more than, say, someone in a suit and tie with, short hair?" And he said to me, "When I first started this job, I had the attitude that I was going to treat everyone the same. But you soon learn that certain people who look a certain way are more likely to commit crime than other people." And I have no doubt that that's true. I have no doubt that the cops target certain people based on their appearance. And to be honest, I'm in 2 minds about it. Part of me doesn't like it and thinks it's incredibly unfair. And like I said, I've been on the receiving end of that. I actually fit in 2 demographics that are targeted by cops. One is metalhead and the other one is male. That's something that we don't really talk about, though, is it? We don't like cops racially profiling people, but profiling people based on gender seems to be perfectly acceptable. I've never heard a feminist say that cops should stop and ask women for ID just as often as they do men. Never seems to come up for some reason. Come to think of it, I can't recall any female headbanger friends in decades ever being stopped by cops and asked for ID. I know for a fact that it's happened to all my male friends, so yeah, I can see that it's unfair, and I know firsthand that it's unfair, and I imagine if you're Aboriginal and being targeted, you would consider that unfair too. I understand why people get pissed off at this. But another part of me also sees it from the cops' point of view. Police are a limited resource. We don't have police standing on every street corner. Thankfully, I mean, I don't want to live in a police state. Hopefully you don't either. But because police are a limited resource, they have to make the most of that resource, which means playing the odds. And if someone in a leather jacket with long hair is more likely to commit a crime than someone in a suit, it stands to reason that they would spend more time scrutinising that person than the guy in the suit, even though it might be fucking unfair. Now, just as there is a negative stereotype associated with metalheads, is there a negative stereotype associated with Aboriginals? The answer is yes. The stereotype is of the drunken Aboriginal, because there is a major problem with alcohol in the Aboriginal community. And unfortunately for Tanya Day and her family, she seems to fit that stereotype perfectly. To be in that state of inebriation at that particular time of day, and for the record it was on a Tuesday, not on the weekend, she would have had to start drinking fairly heavily in the morning, unless of course she was drinking on the train, which may also be a factor. We don't know. Of course it's illegal to drink on V-Line trains. I shouldn't have to point that out. But either she was drinking very heavily in the morning or drinking on the train. And I think the simple fact is, if she had have got on that train completely sober, she'd still be alive today. Now, as I said, alcohol is a major problem in the Aboriginal community. Do you think anyone on this panel is going to bring that up, though? Let's find out.
Nayuka, it's a big and it's a key question, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really difficult. I think when we're talking about institutions like police, I think it's really tempting to think about how can we make the police nicer? Should we hire more black people? Should we have more women?
Oh, I see, because blacks and women are automatically nicer people. Oh, I see, I get it. I get it now. Now, the ironic thing is, I guarantee you everyone on this panel would think the stereotype of the drunken Aboriginal is incredibly wrong and incredibly bigoted. And look, I'm not going to totally disagree with them there. But at the same time, they're perfectly okay about pushing stereotypes of whites and males, and in particular, a combination of white and male. That's perfectly fine, nothing wrong with that, right? Because, you know, as we know, all white males are heartless and they're white supremacists, right? That's the message being pushed here. Nothing stereotypical about that at all.
But what we need to remember is that the police started, like its very formation was to serve the interests of white sovereignty in this country. So...
Oh, is that what the police is for? I thought their purpose was to arrest bad guys. You know, like rapists. I thought feminists were in favour of that.
I don't know if we're talking about accountability. I don't know how far we can go in keeping an organisation like the police to account, because it is there to be violent, it is patriarchal, and it is overwhelmingly white.
Overwhelmingly white. I mean, that is a surprise that the police force would be overwhelmingly white in a white majority country. That really comes as a shock to me. Yes, I thought they would be overwhelmingly people of colour for some reason. I don't know why. But clearly, it's got nothing to do with the majority of the Australian population being white, and everything to do with white supremacy. It's clearly, you know, the white capitalist patriarchy forcing its white supremacy onto the helpless people of colour of Australia. Come to think of it, there are lots of other occupations which are overwhelmingly white too, like teachers and tax accountants and garbage men and pilots. I guess all these organisations are white supremacists and are propped up by the white capitalist patriarchy. Not the taxi drivers though, they're safe. They're obviously part of the good guys.
So how do we... I think it shouldn't exist, but I think,
But how do we do it?
Yeah, you heard that right. She wants to abolish the police. I'm sure that would work out perfectly well. I can't pick any fault with that argument. It sounds like a great idea. I mean, it'd be fantastic if you're a fan of Mad Max and, you really wanted to experience what it was like to live in the world of Mad Max. Then I think abolishing the police would be a perfect idea.
But let's talk about that, because we're nearly 30 years since we had a Royal Commission to black deaths in custody.
Yeah.
One of the key things they found was that public drunkenness should no longer be a criminal offence, and it hasn't changed. So if Royal Commissions aren't doing it, so how do we make this change? And are things changing? Because this is the first inquest, this one into Tanya Day's death, to formally consider systemic racism as a contributing factor. Is that a sign?
Okay, first let's quickly deal with public drunkenness, and I think I've covered that pretty much enough, and then we'll have a look at Aboriginal deaths in custody. So, like I said earlier, I think if someone is causing a major public disturbance or they're a danger to themselves, then yeah, the cops should arrest them and take them off. But if they're just drunk and they're not causing any disturbance, then no, obviously they shouldn't be arrested. And, the cops aren't randomly arresting drunk people on their way home who are causing no one no issues. Otherwise, you'd have to stay at the fucking pub or nightclub until you sobered up, because you'd be arrested the minute you stepped outside. That simple. Now, Aboriginal deaths in custody, that's an entirely different thing. That's a lot more complex. So let's have a quick look at some stats. So the number of deaths in custody in Australia between 2016-17 were 91, and 74 of them were in prison, and 17 deaths occurred in police custody. So the particular case we're talking about with Tanya Day was police custody. Now, 17 isn't a high number, but it's obviously 17 too many. If someone is in police care, they should be, taken care of, right? So the majority of individuals who died in prison and police custody in 2016-17 were male, which is not a surprise, over 35 years of age, and non-Indigenous. Now, the obvious reason for this is because we live in a white majority country. Just like the majority of the police are white, the majority of death in custody is also white. Having said that, the rate of Indigenous death in custody is far higher than the percentage of the Indigenous population. So there is definitely an issue there, and I do think there should be an inquiry as to why. Racism is one possibility. I suspect alcohol is a major cause in a lot of those cases. Once again, that's something that no one on the panel is going to bring up at any point. So let's have a look at the causes of deaths in police custody by manner of death. So overall accidents were 38% and self-inflicted deaths were 31%. Of the 17 police custody and custody-related operational deaths in 2016-17, 4, or 24%, were categorised as accidental, 4, or 24%, were self-inflicted, 4, or 24%, were justifiable homicides, so I'm guessing police shootings, and 3, 18%, resulted from natural causes, and 2, 12%, were classified as other. I'm not exactly sure what would be in the other category.
Mona, how do we get institutions to, acknowledge racism and do something about it? How do we hold people to account?
Well, you're asking the person here who travels the world to say, fuck the patriarchy. So I think that what we have to do is start seriously talking about dismantling patriarchy. And when I talk about patriarchy, I'm talking about a white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy, to quote Black American feminist bell hooks.
Oh, white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy. That particular type of patriarchy. Lucky you specified, because I might have been confused and thought you were talking about the black lesbian patriarchy.
Because what I'm hearing here is very similar to what's happening in the United States. But I also urge everyone to connect it to what so often in the news is portrayed as a problem in my country of birth, Egypt, where police brutality is connected to a fascist state or a militarist state. And so it's very easy for people to say, oh, look, well, the police beat Mona up in Egypt because, Egypt is a dictatorship. And you rarely make that connection between the dictatorship in Egypt and here in Australia, where you're ostensibly a democracy. But what you're talking about is the overwhelming power of the state. And that state is driven by a white supremacist patriarchy. When I look at your Prime Minister, when I look at Donald Trump, when I look at Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in Egypt, when I look at Bolsonaro, all of these men are patriarchal authoritarians. At the heart of the way that they rule is violence. And that violence the violence is meted out to you depending on where in the hierarchy you belong.
Okay, so if we look at the prison population, which is vastly majority men, I guess the ones being targeted by the state are really men?
And so if you're a woman, if you're queer, if you're of colour, if you're disabled, etc., etc. So for me...
Oh, of course not, of course not. No, the state does nothing but help men. Yeah, I should have known.
I say patriarchy is like an octopus. The head of the octopus is misogyny, but the 8 tentacles...
What did she just say? Oh, I think I misheard what she said. She said tentacles. I was going to say that octopus sounded pretty ballsy.
Are these things that we're talking about? So it would be capitalism, it would be police brutality, it would be homophobia, all of these systems of oppression that privilege male dominance, because we're talking about a very specifically male kind of violence, and again, according to the tentacles of the patriarchy. So for me, we have to have a serious discussion. We have to dismantle patriarchy. Does that sound like a pipe dream? It has to be a reality, because it's the year 2019, for those of us who use that calendar, and we're still talking about people being beaten to death by the police. It's unconscionable.
People being beaten to death by the police. Yeah, the only problem with that is the woman in question, Tanya Day, wasn't beaten to death by the police. There is no suggestion that she was beaten to death by the police. She was drunk and fell over in a drunk cell and hit her head. Now, you may have an argument that the police had a duty of care. Maybe they should have checked on her more often. Like I said earlier, I don't know what the procedure is. I don't know how many staff they had. I don't know how busy they were. But possibly there is an argument that they had a duty of care. They should have checked in on her more often, and they are responsible. But at no point is anyone suggesting that they beat her to death. But of course, that's the first assumption a feminist like this would make, right? Because that's what police do, especially the white male ones, which I think it's pretty safe to say she's assuming that these police officers involved were white and male, and quite possibly they were, I don't know. But I have found some additional information about the case, which I want to briefly look at just to finish the video.
He said when he first met 2 V-Line conductors on the train platform, he was told there was an Aboriginal woman who was unruly, intoxicated, and didn't have a ticket on the train.
Okay, so failing to produce a ticket on a train is an offence, and it has a $248 fine. As well as placing feet on anything other than the floor, that's another $248 fine, and we'll get to that bit in a minute. And then there's behaving in an obscene, offensive, threatening, disorderly or riotous manner, which is a $330 fine. Now, the conductor says she was unruly, so I don't know how far she went. I don't know if that means she was refusing to give him information like her name or whether, she was swearing or whatever, right? So that one's a bit iffy, but not having the ticket is probably the main one. That alone is reason to call the police if she doesn't produce ID. Now, I'm not sure about V-Line, but I'm pretty sure it's the same as the metro system here in Melbourne. If you fail to produce ID when you're getting a fine, they can call the cops. That's simple. So I don't believe the cops were called because the ticket inspector was a racist and just hated this poor innocent sleeping Aboriginal woman, and he wanted to pick on her for no particular reason. No, she didn't have a ticket. She was unruly, whatever that means. And then there's this.
He told the inquest when he first saw her she was lying across the seats with her feet over the island, appeared asleep.
He is one of the arresting police officers, by the way, so that's a quote from one of the cops who took her off. But yeah, if you've got your feet across the aisle and you're blocking the aisle and you don't move, yeah, that's reason to call the cops. You can't obstruct other passengers. Now, I would imagine the very first thing a conductor would do is ask someone like that to move, right? Calling the cops would probably be the last thing you would do, because in all likelihood it's going to delay the train, and you probably don't want that. Now, admittedly, I've never worked as a conductor, right? But I could imagine that the very first thing you would do is say, "Excuse me, could you move your feet?" And if the person moves their feet, then that's it, right? It's over. No need to call the cops. But it's pretty obvious she failed to do that or refused to do that.
Others on the train had a look of disgust, and it was obvious to me she was making others on the train uncomfortable, Senior Constable Thomas said.
Now, I want you to imagine just for a minute that instead of a 55-year-old Aboriginal woman, it was a metalhead like myself, right? Imagine I got on the train so blind drunk that, I passed out and it was hard to wake me. And I had my feet across the aisle blocking people. I didn't have a ticket and I was unruly and making other passengers very uncomfortable. I think certain people may refer to my behaviour as toxic masculinity. I've just got a sneaking suspicion. And I also suspect that if the conductor did not call the police, those same people would probably criticise the conductor for not doing so and say that he wasn't doing his job. Now, I don't think someone who's Aboriginal should be targeted with harsher treatment in any way, but I don't think they should get a free pass either.
He said there was a heavy smell of alcohol on her breath as they tried to talk to her, and Miss Day was slurring her words, adding moans and groans a drunk person would make. She was unsteady on her feet and appeared disorientated as he and his partner, Officer Aaron Towns, led her off the train. Police also found spirit and wine bottles in her suitcase.
So, alcohol in her suitcase might suggest that she was drinking on the train, which is also an offence. Now, I was trying to find what the fine was for drinking on the train. I couldn't find it, but I did come across this article from 11 years ago. And apparently it was 11 years ago drinking on V-Line trains was banned. Apparently before then, on really long trips, they had a bar where, some people could have a couple of drinks. Now, I should point out there's a big difference between having a glass of wine on your long trip home and being blind drunk. And the reason why they banned alcohol and got rid of the bar car on these long trips was because of a handful of drunks each month who would drink before getting on the train and carry their alcohol on the train. Sound familiar? So Peter Ryan, who was an Australian politician at the time, said, "There have been incidents that have occurred which are clearly the result of too much alcohol. So if this is going to assist the situation, then it is something I think is a wise decision." And, that makes perfect sense. If they're having a problem with people getting blind drunk and causing hassles on trains, then yes, it's a wise decision to ban alcohol on V-Line trains. Now, the article we were just looking at also says that the senior constable didn't want to take her to the police station, and they tried to contact her family by mobile phone, but her mobile phone did not work. So they clearly couldn't leave someone in that state on the train or just sitting at the station by themselves. So they really had no choice but to take her to the police station. I've also found a timeline of the events because you may recall earlier in this video I said I didn't know when the accident happened or how often they checked on her. This information's here. So she went into the holding cell around 4 o'clock. She suffered the head injury at 10 to 5, so almost an hour later. And the police did their first physical check on her 3 hours after that. But I think this all comes down to, like I said earlier, what is their normal procedure? Is it the normal procedure to put someone in a drunk tank and to leave them there 4 hours and not check on them, not to do a physical check? Because if that is the normal procedure, then you could argue the police are not negligent. If, however, they're meant to do it every hour and they fail to do it, then they really need to come up with a good excuse as to why. And the other question is, would they have treated someone who was white or male or whatever exactly the same? However, I don't think the first conclusion we should jump to is that this entire thing was sparked by racism, nor should we exclude her level of intoxication. And we most definitely shouldn't rewrite history and claim that her death is caused by police brutality, that they actually beat her to death, which clearly is not the case, and then use that lie to claim that we're living in a police state and the police are actually white supremacists who are working for the patriarchy. That is an insane claim, and it's fucking bullshit that is appearing on a TV show funded by my tax money. Anyway, I went into the Tanya Day case a lot further than I intended to, so I didn't get through half the clips that I wanted to. So there will definitely be a part 2 to this video.
Joining me is Daisy Cousins, who runs her own video channel and has also contributed to Spectator Australia. Daisy, lovely to see you, but what do you make of Fran Kelly's curious response? That she should have disavowed one of the 4 women one of them was actually calling for violence, but she missed her chance by that much.
Look, I am going to go out on a limb here and actually give Fran Kelly the benefit of the doubt in this situation. That was an appallingly difficult circumstance that she was in. I would imagine hosting Q&A at the best of times is very difficult, considering the rather emotional nature of a lot of the discussions that go on there. And Fran Kelly is also not the regular host, let alone being on a panel with those 4 women with the huge personalities and very, very aggressive, violent rhetoric as they saw. I mean, putting myself in Fran Kelly's position, if I were hosting a panel with 4 people who were quite literally condoning political violence and being quite explicit in those claims, then I would probably be quite nervous about contradicting any of them, to be perfectly honest. So I'm sure Fran Kelly is very much kicking herself at the moment for not stepping in and not countering their views more, because what's happened, Andrew, is that she is, from what I've observed, in a lot of cases being lumped in with these women's beliefs and these views, and I highly doubt, given the fact she said she should have countered these views, that she actually believes in calls for violence and arson and all of the things that we just saw. So she's stuck between a rock and a hard place with these activists. Does she come outright and denounce them fully now and risk getting attacked online, or does she sit there and twiddle her thumbs and hope it all blows over?
You've been drinking a carton of milk for human kindness. I mean, for heaven's sake, let me first say that if I had 4 people on this show, all calling for violence, let me tell you, the ABC would not be forgiving me, Sleeping Giants would not be forgiving me, the ACMA would not be forgiving me, this show would be off the air, I'd probably be out of a job. I mean, the thing is, she didn't fail to contradict one person, she failed to contradict 4 of them, including the woman that said she agreed with the call for violence from the red-headed woman, let's go and kill. I mean, for heaven's sake, she didn't miss one. She showed a lack of courage in failing to confront 4 of them. They either then or afterwards at the end of the show to say, oh, look, I might have been attacked. I get attacked every single day. You think it stops me? And I've seen you being attacked this week in a grotesque way by some other activists that I won't go into. I won't give her the credit. But the fact that the ABC managing director, he didn't have any problems about, you know, well, people might think I'm bad. He still hasn't figured out that whether this was against the ABC standards after a week of looking. He could have just watched the show for an hour and seen for himself. Are you surprised by this?
Look, I'm not surprised by this reaction at all, because I think that he knows perfectly well why and how this was against ABC standards, and certainly the 200 people who complained about this episode, I'm sure, were extremely clear in why they thought it breached the ABC's standards. But I think, you know, on the subject of people having courage to challenge these things, I think he possibly is lacking in a bit of that, because if you view this through his prism as a white man, as the head of the ABC, poised to denounce and contradict these 4 women of colour who are feminists, spouting feminist ideals. He knows how aggressive these online activists are, and he knows exactly what will happen, Andrew, if he opens his mouth and said this is wrong. He will be absolutely crucified in the online realm and in the online media. So I think this is less a matter of him figuring out whether or not it was wrong. I'm sure he knows that this is him figuring out how to actually say it in the least inflammatory way possible. So that's a rock and a hard place right there.
How to save his heart. I think, look, now that you say it, I think you're absolutely right on that point, because of seeing that the red-headed woman, the one that was calling for men to be raped if women thought men to be murdered if women thought they were rapists, has gone on to say that Scott Morrison is a white misogynist. So what the ABC managing director would cop, honestly, harden up these guys, harden up.
Ein Haufen Zombies uns herum und die Nächte werden länger. Für kurz 2 Tage noch Munition, danach dann nur noch unsere Hände. Woher sie kommen, wohin sie gehen, darüber denken wir nicht nach.